The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds of my house in Cedar Ridge, cutting golden strips across the oak table where Caroline and I used to share our coffee. I sat alone now, same chair, same mug, the blue ceramic one with the tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she'd say, running her thumb over the imperfection the way she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and looked out at the backyard. The maple tree we'd planted for our 30th anniversary was showing its first hints of autumn color, leaves beginning their slow turn from green to gold. Caroline had chosen that spot carefully, measuring the morning light, calculating where the shade would fall in summer. She'd had a way of thinking ahead, of building things that would matter later. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. I'd built most of the furniture myself back when my hands were steadier, and my back didn't remind me of every piece of lumber I'd lifted. The kitchen cabinets with their hand-cut dovetail joints, the built-in bookcases where Caroline had arranged her gardening magazines and mystery novels in neat rows, the dining room table where we'd hosted Christmas dinners for 27 years, until the cancer took her voice and then took her. Everything here carried her fingerprints, her choices, her quiet laughter. Even 3 years after the funeral, I sometimes caught myself setting 2 cups on the counter before remembering. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway pulled me from my thoughts. A familiar engine, Ethan's new SUV, the one I'd helped him finance 2 years ago when his consulting business was struggling. Through the window, I watched my son step out, adjusting his tie with the practiced motion of a man who'd learned to dress for success. Behind him came Madison, my daughter-in-law, picking her way across the stones in heels that were too high for a casual visit. And then 2 other figures I recognized from wedding photos, Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents. They moved with the deliberate formation of people who'd rehearsed this moment, who'd planned what they were going to say before they knocked on my door. Gerald carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent his career in middle management, used to delivering news that other people wouldn't like. Patricia clutched her purse like a shield, her smile already fixed in place. I opened the door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days. Better to meet trouble on your own terms than wait for it to find you. "Morning," I said, stepping back to let them pass. "Dad?" Ethan's smile was bright but brittle. "We need to talk." I led them into the living room, the same room where Caroline and I had unwrapped presents on countless Christmas mornings, where we'd watched the news on September 11th with our coffee growing cold in our hands. They arranged themselves on the sofa Caroline had reupholstered in soft green fabric, while I took my reading chair by the window. The morning light caught the dust motes in the air between us. "This is a beautiful home, Richard," Patricia said, her eyes already cataloging the details. The hardwood floors Caroline and I had refinished together, the stone fireplace I'd built with my own hands, the custom built-ins that had taken me 3 weekends to complete. "Caroline had good taste," I replied. Madison shifted uncomfortably. She'd never known how to respond when I mentioned Caroline, as if death might be contagious if she acknowledged it too directly. "That's actually what we wanted to discuss," Ethan said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man delivering important news. "The future of this place." I waited. In construction, you learn that silence is often more powerful than words. People fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intend to share. "Richard," Gerald began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man used to selling ideas, "we've been thinking about your situation here. This house is quite large for one person. The maintenance alone must be overwhelming." "I manage," I said quietly. "Of course you do," Patricia added quickly. "But at your age, wouldn't it be nice to have less responsibility, less to worry about?" The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel them waiting for my response, watching my face for signs of weakness or compliance. "Madison's parents need a place to stay," Ethan continued, his voice taking on the station tone you'd use with a child. "Their lease is up next month, and with Dad's retirement—" He gestured toward Gerald, who nodded gravely, as if confirming a tragedy. "We've been looking at senior communities," Gerald said, "but the good ones have waiting lists. And the costs—" He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "We thought," Madison said, her voice soft but insistent, "maybe this could work for everyone. This house has so much space. More than you need, really." I looked around the room, seeing it suddenly through their eyes. Not as the home Caroline and I had built together, but as square footage to be redistributed, as assets to be managed. "You want me to move out," I said. It wasn't a question. "Not immediately," Ethan said quickly. "We could work something out. Maybe the guest room upstairs, just until we figure out a more permanent solution." The guest room. In my own house. I stood and walked to the mantel, where our wedding photo sat in its silver frame. Caroline in her grandmother's dress, me in a rented tux, both of us impossibly young and certain that love was enough to build a life on. Behind the glass, her smile seemed to offer some kind of guidance I couldn't quite grasp. "This isn't just a house," I said without turning around. "It's 32 years of marriage. It's where Caroline planted her roses. It's where you learned to ride your bike, where you brought your first girlfriend to meet us, where you told us you were getting married." "Dad," Ethan's voice carried a note of frustration now, "that's exactly the problem. You're holding on to the past. Mom's been gone for 3 years. Don't you think it's time to let go?" I turned to face him. My son. The boy I'd taught to throw a curveball, who'd helped me rebuild the deck when he was 16, who'd cried in this very room when his first business failed, and I'd held him and told him that failure was just practice for success. "Let go of what, exactly?" I asked. "This," Madison said, gesturing around the room as if the answer was obvious. "All of this, the memories, the stuff. You're rattling around in here like a ghost." "Maybe I am," I said quietly, "but it's my house to haunt." Gerald leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of a man closing a deal. "Richard, we're family now. That means we help each other. We share resources. We make practical decisions." "Practical," I repeated the word slowly, tasting it. "Your name isn't even on the mortgage anymore," Ethan said. And something in his voice, a note of finality, of accomplished fact, made my blood run cold. The room went very still. Even the grandfather clock seemed to pause between ticks. "What did you say?" Madison glanced at Ethan, her eyes wide, but he held my gaze, his jaw set with determination. "I said your name isn't on the mortgage. I had it transferred. For tax purposes. It's all legal." The words hit me like cold water. I felt my heart rate quicken, the familiar flutter that the doctor had warned me to watch for. But I kept my voice steady. "You had it transferred. Dad, you weren't thinking clearly after Mom died. All that debt, the medical bills. I was trying to protect you. Protect the house. By taking my name off it." Patricia cleared her throat delicately. "Richard, Ethan was looking out for your best interests. Sometimes family has to make difficult decisions." I walked back to my chair and sat down slowly, my mind racing. The mortgage had been paid off for 8 years. Caroline and I had burned the papers in the fireplace, celebrating with a bottle of wine that had cost more than we could afford. So, what mortgage was Ethan talking about? Unless... "What kind of mortgage did you take out?" I asked. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Gerald adjusted his collar. Madison studied her fingernails. Patricia's smile flickered like a candle in a draft. "A home equity line of credit," Ethan said finally. "Just to help with some investments, business opportunities. It's all very manageable." "On my house." "On the family house. That's the point, Dad. We're all in this together." I looked at each of them in turn. 4 faces watching me, waiting for me to accept their logic, to nod and smile, and make their lives easier by disappearing from my own. "I see," I said quietly. "Do you?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice warming with what he probably thought was persuasion. "Because we really think this could work. Gerald and Patricia move in here, you get a nice apartment somewhere with less upkeep, and everyone's happy." "Everyone," I repeated. "Family takes care of family," Madison added. "That's what marriage means. That's what commitment looks like." I stood up again, this time with the careful movements of a man who just realized the ground beneath his feet wasn't as solid as he'd thought. "I need to think about this," I said. "Of course," Gerald said quickly. "Take all the time you need, but not too much time. Our lease is up next month," I finished. "You mentioned that." They filed out with the satisfied air of people who'd accomplished what they'd come to do. Ethan lingered at the door, his hand on the frame. "Dad, I know this is a lot, but it's the right thing. Mom would have wanted us to stick together." I looked at him for a long moment, this stranger wearing my son's face. "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't tell me what your mother would have wanted." After they left, I stood in the hallway listening to the grandfather clock tick away the seconds. The house felt different now, as if someone had shifted the walls just enough to throw off the angles. I walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture Caroline and I had chosen together, the pictures we'd framed, the small objects that had accumulated over 32 years of shared life. In my study, I opened the desk drawer where we'd kept our important papers. The mortgage documents were there, yellowed with age, stamped "paid in full" in red ink. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of what Ethan had told me. My name wasn't on the mortgage anymore. The words echoed in my head as I made myself a sandwich I didn't eat, as I tried to read a book that might as well have been written in a foreign language, as I sat in Caroline's chair and watched the shadows lengthen across the yard she'd loved so much. That evening, I called my lawyer. Marcus Chen had handled our real estate transactions for 15 years, had drawn up Caroline's will, had helped me navigate the insurance claims after she died. His voice was warm with familiar concern. "Richard, what can I do for you?" I told him about the visit, about Ethan's claim that my name was no longer on the mortgage. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "Richard," he said finally, "your house has been paid off for years. I have the records right here. If someone's taken out a new mortgage, they would have needed your signature. Unless what? Unless they forged it, which would be fraud." I hung up and sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and fell silent. A car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across the living room walls before disappearing. I thought about the boy who used to help me in the garage, handing me tools with grease-stained fingers, asking endless questions about how things worked. I thought about the teenager who'd brought Caroline flowers on Mother's Day, picked from the garden she'd taught him to tend. I thought about the young man who had stood in this very room and promised to love Madison for better or worse, in sickness and in health. And I thought about the stranger who had sat on Caroline's sofa this morning and told me I was no longer welcome in my own home. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking the end of a day that had changed everything. I got up slowly, checked the locks, turned off the lights, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Caroline for 29 years. On her nightstand, the small silver-framed photo of us on our wedding day caught the moonlight. Her smile was radiant, certain, full of faith in the future we were going to build together. I picked up the frame and held it in my hands. "What would you do, Caroline?" I whispered to the empty room. "What would you want me to do?" But the only answer was the wind rustling through the maple tree outside our window, and the steady tick of time moving forward whether I was ready or not. I placed the photo back on the nightstand and lay down in the bed that felt too big for one person. But as I closed my eyes, I found myself thinking not about what I'd lost, but about what I still had. This house, these walls, this foundation that Caroline and I had built with our own hands. They might have put their names on some papers, they might have made their plans and rehearsed their arguments, but they didn't know everything. They didn't know about the copies of the original deed locked in the safe deposit box at First National. They didn't know about the detailed records I'd kept of every improvement, every repair, every dollar invested in this property over 3 decades. They didn't know about Marcus Chen and his meticulous filing system. Most importantly, they didn't know that the man they just tried to push out wasn't the same man who'd been sleepwalking through grief for 3 years. Caroline's death had broken something in me, something I'd thought was irreparable. But sitting there in the darkness, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in my chest, I realized that something else had been healing without my notice. My spine was straightening, my jaw was setting, my hands, which had been shaking slightly when they left, were now perfectly steady. Tomorrow, I would start making some calls. Tonight, I would plan. And if my own son thought he could steal the house that Caroline built, he was about to learn that he'd picked a fight with the wrong man. The clock ticked steadily in the darkness, counting down the hours until dawn, until I could begin to take back what was mine. The morning came gray and cold, with the kind of October chill that seeps into your bones and stays there. I woke before the alarm, my body's internal clock still set to the rhythm of 40 years in construction. 6:30 sharp, same as always, though I no longer had crews to manage or job sites to inspect. I made coffee in the machine Caroline had bought me for Christmas 5 years ago, back when she was still making Christmas lists and wrapping presents with the precision of an engineer. The blue mug felt familiar in my hands, its weight a small comfort against the hollowness that had settled in my chest overnight. In the morning light, yesterday's conversation felt both more real and more surreal. I kept replaying Ethan's words. Your name isn't even on the mortgage anymore, trying to find some innocent explanation, some misunderstanding that would make sense of what he'd said. But the cold certainty in his voice kept coming back to me, the way Madison had avoided my eyes when he said it, the satisfied look on Gerald's face, like a man who had just played his ace. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and tried to remember when things had started to change between Ethan and me. It hadn't been sudden, this distance. It had crept in slowly, like water finding cracks in a foundation. After Caroline's diagnosis, Ethan had been attentive at first. He'd driven up from the city for doctor appointments, had sat with me in those sterile waiting rooms while oncologists delivered their careful prognoses. But as the treatment stretched on, as hope gave way to comfort care, he'd started pulling back. Phone calls became shorter, visits became less frequent. I'd told myself he was protecting himself, that watching his mother fade was too hard for him to bear. I'd made excuses when he missed her last birthday, when he couldn't make it to the hospice until 2 days after she'd died. Grief affects everyone differently, I'd reasoned. Some people need distance to cope. But looking back now, I wondered if it had been something else entirely, if he'd started seeing Caroline and me not as his parents, but as obligations he couldn't wait to shed. The garage door creaked as I lifted it, the familiar sound echoing off the concrete walls. This had been my sanctuary for 32 years, the place where I'd rebuilt engines, crafted furniture, and taught Ethan to use tools properly. The workbench still held the vise I'd bought at an estate sale in '91, its cast iron jaws scarred from decades of use. I ran my hand along its surface, remembering summer afternoons when Ethan was 12, 13, 14. He'd stand on a milk crate beside me, tongue poking out in concentration, as he learned to measure twice and cut once. His small hands had been surprisingly steady, his attention to detail impressive for a boy his age. "Why do you build things, Dad?" he had asked once, sanding a piece of oak that would become part of Caroline's sewing table. "Because something that lasts feels good in your hands," I'd told him. "Because when you make something well, you put a piece of yourself into it. Long after you're gone, that piece remains." He'd nodded seriously, as if filing away wisdom for future use. But somewhere between that earnest boy and the man who'd sat on my sofa yesterday, something fundamental had changed. The boy who'd valued craftsmanship had grown into a man who saw everything as a transaction. Back inside the house, I spread the old mortgage documents on the dining room table. The papers were yellowed at the edges but still legible, each page signed in both my handwriting and Caroline's careful script. The final payment had been made on March 15th, 2015. We'd celebrated with dinner at Romano's, the Italian place where we'd had our first date 34 years earlier. I photographed each document with my phone, then locked them back in the desk drawer. Whatever Ethan had done, these papers were proof of the truth, but I needed to understand exactly what kind of lie he'd constructed. The phone call came at 9:15. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. "Mr. Dalton, this is Jennifer Walsh from Pinnacle Mortgage Services. I'm calling about your home equity line of credit application." The words hit me like a physical blow. I didn't apply for any credit line. A pause. "I'm showing here that we received an application 3 weeks ago, signed and notarized. The loan has already been approved and funded." "Funded for how much?" $250,000, sir. The funds were direct deposited to the account on file. I sat down heavily, my free hand gripping the edge of the table. $250,000 against a house that had been paid off for 8 years. "Ma'am," I said, working to keep my voice steady, "I need you to fax me copies of everything you have. That application, those signatures, all of it." "Is there a problem, Mr. Dalton?" "Yes," I said quietly. "There's a very big problem." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of the dining room, staring at the china cabinet Caroline had inherited from her mother. Inside were the good plates we'd used for holidays, the crystal glasses that caught the light just so, the silver service she'd polished every Christmas Eve. All of it was mine. The house was mine, but somehow someone had borrowed $250,000 against it, and I was betting I knew who that someone was. The fax arrived at 11:30. I drove to the FedEx store in town and stood at the machine, watching page after page roll out. Application forms, credit checks, income statements, and there, on the signature lines, my name written in handwriting that looked almost right but wasn't quite. The notary stamp was from a company in Madison's hometown, 3 hours away. The notary's name was Patricia Simmons. Patricia. Not Patricia Monroe, that would have been too obvious, but close enough to make me wonder if Gerald's wife had family connections in the business. I studied the forged signatures under the fluorescent lights of the copy center. Whoever had done this had been careful. The handwriting was close enough to pass a casual inspection, confident enough to fool a busy loan officer. But I'd been signing my own name for 72 years. I knew the way the R in Richard connected to the I, the distinctive loop in the D of Dalton. These signatures were good, but they weren't mine. Back home, I called Marcus Chen again. "I need to see you," I said when he answered. "Today, if possible. And Marcus, bring everything you have on my property. Every deed, every transfer, every piece of paper that proves I own this house." "Richard, what's going on?" "Someone stole $250,000 using my house as collateral, and I think I know who did it." Marcus's office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, the kind of unremarkable space that inspired confidence rather than awe. He'd handled legal work for half the contractors in the county, had a reputation for being thorough, honest, and protective of his clients' interests. He spread the mortgage documents across his conference table like a doctor examining x-rays. The original papers I'd brought, the forged application from Pinnacle, bank statements, property records. His face grew darker with each page he reviewed. "This is fraud," he said finally. "Clear, unambiguous, prosecutable fraud." "Can they force me to honor it? The loan?" "Not if we can prove you didn't sign for it, and we can." He pointed to the signature analysis he'd been working on. "The pressure points are wrong. The letter formations are close but not exact. Any handwriting expert worth his salt will confirm these aren't your signatures." "So, what's my next move?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We file a police report. We notify Pinnacle that the signatures are forged. We demand an immediate investigation. And in the meantime? In the meantime, that money sits in whatever account they deposited it to, and whoever took it out is going to have some very uncomfortable questions to answer." I thought about Ethan's confident demeanor yesterday. The way he'd announced my name was off the mortgage like it was a done deal. The expensive SUV in my driveway, Madison's designer handbag, Gerald's talk of investment opportunities. "Marcus," I said slowly, "if someone commits fraud to get a loan and then they spend that money, what happens to them? If we can prove intent to defraud, prison time, significant prison time." I stared out his office window at the courthouse across the street, its limestone facade weathered but enduring. Caroline and I had been married on those steps 47 years ago, full of hope and dreams and absolute faith in each other. Now, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, discussing whether to send my own son to prison. "I need some time to think about this," I said. "Don't think too long," Marcus warned. "The longer that fraud stands on the books, the more complicated it becomes to unravel." The drive home took me past the elementary school, where Ethan had played Little League, past the high school, where he'd been valedictorian, past the community college, where he'd taken his first business courses. At each landmark, I found myself remembering a different version of my son. The 8-year-old who'd cried when he struck out in the championship game. The teenager who'd worked summers on my construction crews, complaining about the heat but never quitting. The young man who'd called me from college, homesick and uncertain, asking for advice about choosing a major. When had that boy disappeared? When had he become someone capable of stealing from his own father? Back at the house, I sat in Caroline's chair by the window, watching the afternoon light slant across the yard. The roses she had planted were in their final bloom of the season, deep red petals beginning to drop onto the mulch. She'd loved this time of year, the melancholy beauty of things ending gracefully. The phone rang at 4 o'clock, Ethan's name on the caller ID. "Dad, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. Have you had a chance to think about what we discussed?" "I've thought about it." "And?" I watched a cardinal land on the maple tree, its red feathers bright against the turning leaves. Caroline had loved cardinals, had said they were messages from people who had passed on. "I think there are some things we need to discuss," I said. "About mortgages, about signatures, about honesty." A pause. Then, "Dad, I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you know exactly what I mean." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculated. Dad, you're not thinking clearly. Yesterday proved that. You're confused, you're living in the past, and you're making decisions that don't make sense. Maybe it's time to consider that you need help. Real help. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If I fought him on the house, he'd try to have me declared incompetent. It was a card I should have seen coming. Is that what you think? I asked. That I'm confused? I think you're grieving. I think you're alone. And I think you're scared of change. But, Dad, change is coming whether you're ready for it or not. I stood up and walked to the mantel, where Caroline's picture smiled at me from its silver frame. Her eyes were bright with intelligence, with the strength that had carried her through the 32 years of marriage, 3 miscarriages, my heart attack, and finally her own terminal diagnosis. You're right, I said into the phone. Change is coming, but maybe not the kind you're expecting. What's that supposed to mean? It means I love you, son, but I won't be bullied. Not by you, not by Madison, and not by her parents. I hung up and set the phone on the side table. Through the window, the cardinal flew away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, the mortgage papers spread out beside my plate. The forged signatures seemed to mock me in the overhead light, evidence of a betrayal so deep, I was still struggling to accept it. But as I sat there in the quiet house, surrounded by the furniture Caroline and I had chosen together, the pictures we'd framed, the life we'd built, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Anger. Not the hot, destructive kind that makes you do stupid things. This was cold anger, the kind that clears your thinking and sharpens your focus, the kind that builds strategies instead of throwing punches. I cleared the dishes, folded the papers neatly, and went upstairs to bed. But before I turned out the light, I made a mental list of phone calls I needed to make tomorrow. Marcus Chen, the police, Pinnacle Mortgage, my bank, and maybe, if I was feeling generous, one more call to my son, to give him a chance to make this right before I did what needed to be done. Caroline's picture watched me from the nightstand, her smile eternally patient, eternally loving. But in the lamplight, I thought I could see something else in her eyes, not just love, but steel. The kind of strength that had built this house, brick by brick, beam by beam, until it became something that could weather any storm. I won't let them take it, I whispered to her photograph. I promise you that. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending the last of the autumn leaves skittering across the yard. But inside, the house stood solid and strong, its foundation unshakable, just like its owner. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The morning brought frost on the windows and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I woke at 5:30, an hour before the alarm, my mind already cataloging the day's tasks with the precision of a man who'd once managed construction crews across 3 counties. But first, I needed to talk to Caroline. I made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness and carried it upstairs to our bedroom, where her presence still lingered in the faint scent of lavender sachets tucked in the dresser drawers. Her side of the bed remained exactly as she'd left it, pillow fluffed, reading glasses on the nightstand beside a half-finished crossword puzzle she'd never complete. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her photograph, the one from our 25th anniversary trip to Maine. She was laughing at something I'd said, her head tilted back, hair catching the sunlight. The camera had captured her in a moment of pure joy, before the diagnosis, before the treatments, before the slow dimming of her light. I need your guidance here, I said to the silent room. I need to know what you'd want me to do. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator hummed to life, but in the growing light of dawn, I could almost hear her voice, practical and steady as always. Don't you dare let them erase what we built together. I'd met Caroline 34 years ago at a church social, both of us hiding from over-eager matchmakers behind the dessert table. She was volunteering at the children's hospital then, reading stories to kids who were too sick to go home. I was building houses and dreaming of building something more, a family, a legacy, a life that mattered. Our first real conversation had been about foundation work. Her grandmother's house was settling, and she needed advice about underpinning. Most women would have glazed over when I started talking about load-bearing walls and soil compression. Caroline took notes. If you're going to fix something, she'd said, you need to understand why it broke in the first place. We were married 18 months later, right here in Cedar Ridge, in the little Methodist church where she'd sung in the choir since she was 12. The reception was in the church basement, decorated with flowers from her mother's garden and lit by strings of lights I'd installed myself. We couldn't afford much, but we had each other, and that had felt like enough for anything. The house came 2 years later, when my construction business finally turned a real profit. We'd looked at dozens of properties before Caroline spotted this one, a rundown colonial on 3 acres, with good bones and terrible everything else. The previous owners had let it decay for years, but Caroline saw past the peeling paint and sagging porch to the potential underneath. "It just needs love," she'd said, running her hand along the banister of the front stairs. Good love, applied consistently over time. She'd been right, as usual. We'd spent the first 5 years of our marriage gutting and rebuilding, room by room, working nights and weekends to transform that broken-down house into something beautiful. Caroline chose every paint color, every light fixture, every piece of hardware with the care of an artist creating a masterpiece. But it was more than just aesthetics. Caroline understood that a home wasn't just about walls and windows. It was about the life you lived inside them. She planned spaces for the children we hoped to have, created corners where conversations could flourish, built routines that would bind us together across decades. The miscarriages had nearly broken us. 3 times we'd painted nurseries and assembled cribs, only to pack them away again with hearts too heavy for words. After the 3rd loss, Caroline had sat in this very bedroom and wept until I thought she might disappear entirely, but she'd been stronger than grief. Instead of more children, she'd poured her maternal energy into the neighborhood kids, into her volunteer work at the hospital, into making our home a place where anyone could find warmth and welcome. Ethan's friends had all called her Mrs. C and treated her kitchen like their second home. She'd loved Ethan with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who'd lost too much already. When he'd struggled with math in 3rd grade, she'd sat with him at this same kitchen table every night until the concepts clicked. When he'd been cut from the basketball team in high school, she'd driven to the coach's house and argued his case so persuasively that they'd created a manager position just for him. Even when he had left for college, even when his phone calls became less frequent and his visits more perfunctory, she'd made excuses for him. "He's finding his own way," she'd say. "That's what we raised him to do." But I remembered the hurt in her eyes when he'd missed her 60th birthday, when he'd canceled Christmas dinner 3 years running, when he'd moved in with Madison without bringing her to meet us first. Caroline had hidden her disappointment behind brave smiles, but I'd seen the way she'd wait by the phone on Sundays, hoping he might call. The engagement announcement had come via text message, a photograph of Madison's ring, expensive and ostentatious, followed by a casual, "Guess we're getting married." Caroline had stared at the phone for a long time, then quietly deleted the message. "Aren't you happy for him?" I'd asked. "I'm happy he's happy," she'd said carefully. "But I wish I understood what kind of happiness requires keeping your family at arm's length." The wedding had been elaborate and cold, held at some country club where we didn't know anyone and felt like unwelcome guests at our own son's celebration. Madison's parents had monopolized the planning, the seating arrangements, even the mother-son dance. Caroline had been relegated to the sidelines, wearing the dress she'd bought with her own money because no one had thought to include her in the planning. I'd watched her across the reception hall, sitting alone at our assigned table, while Gerald Monroe gave a toast about welcoming Ethan into their family. Her hands had been folded in her lap, her smile frozen in place, but I'd seen the way her shoulders had curved inward, as if protecting herself from invisible blows. That night, back in our hotel room, she'd finally let the mask drop. "I feel like I'm losing him," she'd whispered, "like someone's erasing me from his life, one memory at a time." I'd tried to reassure her, to tell her that marriage changes people but doesn't erase their history. But deep down, I'd felt it too. The growing distance, the subtle but unmistakable message that we were being demoted from parents to acquaintances. Caroline's diagnosis had come 6 months later. Stage 3 ovarian cancer, caught too late for optimism but early enough for hope. We'd faced it the way we'd faced everything else, together, with quiet determination and an unshakable faith in each other. Ethan had rallied initially, driving up from the city for doctor appointments and chemo sessions. But as the months wore on, as hope gave way to reality, he'd found reasons to be elsewhere, business trips that couldn't be postponed, work emergencies that required his immediate attention, 1,000 small betrayals disguised as unavoidable circumstances. Caroline had never complained, but I'd seen the way she'd save up stories to tell him during his brief visits, as if rationing her maternal energy for the moments when he might actually listen. She'd ask about his work, his marriage, his plans for the future, gathering crumbs of information like a woman hoarding food during a famine. The last conversation they'd had was burned into my memory. Caroline had been in hospice for a week, drifting in and out of consciousness, her voice reduced to whispers. Ethan had finally come, bringing Madison with him like a shield against the reality of what was happening. "I'm proud of you," Caroline had managed to say, her words slurred by medication but clear in intent. "I'm proud of the man you've become." Ethan had shifted uncomfortably, checking his phone even as she spoke. "Thanks, Mom. You just focus on getting better, okay?" But we'd all known there was no getting better. Caroline had smiled anyway, saving her strength for the words that mattered most. "Take care of your father," she'd whispered. "Promise me you'll take care of each other." "Of course," Ethan had said, but his attention was already elsewhere, already planning his escape from the suffocating reality of her dying. She'd passed 3 days later, in the early hours of a Tuesday morning when the world was still and quiet. I'd been holding her hand, telling her stories about the house we'd built, the life we'd shared, the love that would outlast mortality itself. Her last breath had been as gentle as her first hello, all those years ago at the church social. Ethan had arrived 2 hours later, dry-eyed and efficient, immediately focused on funeral arrangements and estate details. He'd handled the logistics with businesslike precision, but I'd noticed how he had avoided looking at her body, how he'd stepped back when I'd leaned down to kiss her forehead one last time. At the funeral, he had delivered a eulogy that could have been written about any mother anywhere, generic phrases about sacrifice and love that contained no specific memories, no personal details that might have revealed the depth of what we'd lost. Madison had sat in the front pew, checking her phone throughout the service. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of holidays spent alone, of phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent, of a son who'd seemed to view his father's grief as an inconvenience rather than a natural response to devastating loss. Now, sitting in the bedroom Caroline and I had shared for 29 years, I understood something that had been nagging at me since yesterday's confrontation. This wasn't just about money or property, or even family dynamics. This was about erasure. Madison and her parents didn't just want my house. They wanted to eliminate any trace of the life Caroline and I had built together. They wanted to strip away the memories, the connections, the evidence that we'd ever mattered at all. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed that grief had made me weak, that 3 years of loneliness had broken my will to fight. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I finished my coffee and walked downstairs to the kitchen, where Caroline's presence was strongest. Her coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer, though I hadn't used it since the day she died. Her cookbooks lined the shelf above the stove, their pages marked with her careful notes about adjusting recipes for high altitude and family preferences. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a lighthouse, was the last grocery list she'd written. Milk, bread, bananas, ordinary things for an ordinary Tuesday that had turned out to be anything but ordinary. I'd kept the list as a talisman, a reminder that love lived in small gestures as much as grand declarations. Now I pulled down a fresh notepad and began writing my own list. Not groceries, but actions. Steps I needed to take to protect what Caroline and I had built together. At the top I wrote, "Call Marcus, file fraud report." Below that, "Bank, freeze any accounts connected to loan." Then, "Police, criminal complaint." And finally, "Document everything. Photos, records, timeline." I was adding more items when the phone rang. Madison's voice, honey sweet and artificially warm. "Richard, I hope you don't mind me calling so early. I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I think we may have overwhelmed you with too much information at once." "Did you?" "Well, yes. Change is always difficult, especially when you're dealing with grief. But, Richard, we really are trying to help. We want what's best for everyone." I walked to the window and looked out at the garden Caroline had tended for 30 years. The roses were past their prime now, but they'd bloom again next spring if someone took proper care of them. "Madison," I said quietly, "let me ask you something. When you and Ethan were planning your wedding, how would you have felt if someone had told you it wasn't really your day, that other people knew what was best for you, A pause. That's different. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you've decided that my life, my home, and my future are yours to manage, without asking what I might want. Richard, we're family. Family, I interrupted, doesn't forge signatures on loan documents. The silence that followed and was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Finally, Madison's voice came back, harder now, stripped of its artificial sweetness. I don't know what you think you know. I know $250,000 was borrowed against this house using forged signatures. I know the notary was someone named Patricia Simmons, which is quite a coincidence given your mother's first name. And I know that money is sitting in someone's bank account right now, waiting to be spent on God knows what. You're confused. I'm a lot of things, Madison, but confused isn't one of them. I hung up and immediately called Marcus Chen. It's time, I said when he answered. File everything. Police report, fraud complaint, the whole works. Richard, are you sure? Once we start this process, there's no going back. I looked around the kitchen Caroline had designed, at the heart of the home we'd built together. The morning light was streaming through the windows now, warming the oak cabinets and granite countertops, illuminating the space where we'd shared 32 years of morning coffee and evening conversations. Marcus, I said, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. After I hung up, I walked through the house one more time, seeing it with fresh eyes. Not as a collection of rooms and furniture, but as a testament to the life Caroline and I had created together. Every picture frame told a story. Every piece of furniture held a memory. Every carefully chosen detail reflected her love for beauty, order, and the kind of home that sheltered not just bodies, but souls. They could forge my signature on loan documents. They could make their plans and deliver their ultimatums. They could try to paint me as a confused old man who didn't know what was best for him. But they couldn't erase what Caroline and I had built together. They couldn't steal the memories embedded in these walls. And they couldn't break the promise I'd made to her in this very room, holding her hand as she slipped away from me. Take care of each other. I'd failed her in that promise once, letting grief consume me while our son drifted away. But I wouldn't fail her again. This house was more than property. It was a love letter written in wood and stone, a testament to the faith that two people could build something beautiful and lasting together. And I'd be damned if I was going to let anyone tear it down. Marcus Chen's office smelled of coffee and old leather, the kind of place where serious business got handled without fanfare. I'd arrived early, carrying a briefcase full of documents that represented 32 years of careful record-keeping. Caroline had always insisted on keeping receipts, filing warranties, documenting every improvement we'd made to the house. At the time, it had seemed like harmless obsession. Now, it felt like providence. Richard, Marcus stood as I entered, his handshake firm and reassuring. I've been thinking about this all night. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand what we're setting in motion. I set the briefcase on his conference table and clicked it open. Inside were deed copies, mortgage documents, improvement records, insurance claims, and photographs dating back 3 decades. The documentary evidence of a life well lived and carefully protected. I understand that my son forged my signature to steal $250,000, I said quietly. I understand that he is planning to force me out of my own home, and I understand that if I don't stop him now, he'll do it again. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd known me for 15 years. Had handled the legal work when I'd incorporated my construction business, had helped us navigate Caroline's medical bills and insurance claims. He knew I wasn't the type to make accusations lightly. Let me show you what I've found, he said, spreading his own documents across the table. The first set was from Pinnacle Mortgage, the loan application, credit checks, and signature pages. Marcus had enlarged the signatures, comparing them to authentic samples from my business files. Even to my untrained eye, the differences were obvious once you knew what to look for. The forger was good, Marcus said, pointing to the subtle variations with a red pen, but not perfect. The pressure points are wrong here, the letter spacing is slightly off there, and this flourish at the end of your last name, you've never written it that way, not once in 20 years of documents. The second set was more interesting. Marcus had run a property search, tracing every transaction involving my house back to the original purchase. What he had found was a paper trail that revealed the sophistication of the fraud. They didn't just forge your signature on the loan, he explained. 3 months ago, they filed papers with the county clerk adding Ethan as a co-owner of the property. The deed transfer was backdated to make it look like it happened years ago, but the filing stamps tell a different story. I studied the documents, feeling a cold anger settle in my chest. So, he's been planning this for months. At least. And Richard, there's something else. The money from the loan, it didn't sit in an account somewhere. It was moved immediately. $50,000 to an investment account in Ethan's name. $75,000 to pay off debts listed under Madison's Social Security number. $100,000 to something called GM Holdings, LLC. GM Holdings? Gerald Monroe Holdings. Madison's father incorporated it 6 weeks ago. According to the filing papers, it's a real estate investment company. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. This hadn't been a desperate grab for money, it had been a carefully orchestrated plan to liquidate my assets and distribute them among the conspirators. They'd probably spent months planning, researching, preparing for the moment when they could present me with their fait accompli. "What are my options?" I asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers the way he did when he was working through complex legal problems. "Legally, we have them dead to rights. Fraud, forgery, theft by deception. Any prosecutor would jump at a case this clear-cut. We file criminal complaints, they get arrested, they go to prison. But these are family members, Richard, your son, your daughter-in-law, her parents. Once we pull this trigger, there's no putting the bullet back in the gun. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the boy who'd helped me build Caroline's garden shed, who'd spent countless hours in my workshop learning the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. I thought about the young man who'd called me from college, homesick and uncertain about his future. I thought about the son who'd stood beside me at Caroline's funeral, dry-eyed but present. Then I thought about the stranger who'd sat on my sofa 2 days ago and told me I was no longer welcome in my own home. "I'm prepared," I said quietly. Marcus nodded and reached for his phone, but before he could dial, I held up a hand. "I want to do this right," I said. "Not just the legal part, the strategic part. These people think they're smarter than an old widower who's lost his edge. I want them to keep thinking that right up until the moment they realize how wrong they were." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. "What did you have in mind?" I pulled out the notepad where I had been sketching ideas since dawn. "First, we secure the property, change all the locks, install a security system, make sure they can't just walk in and take possession while we're fighting this in court." "Smart. What else?" "Then we let them think they're winning. Don't tip our hand about the criminal charges yet. Let them get comfortable, maybe even start spending more of that money. The deeper they dig themselves in, the harder it'll be to claim this was all a misunderstanding." Marcus was taking notes now, his pen moving quickly across a legal pad. "And then we hit them with everything at once. Criminal charges, civil suits, asset freezes, the whole works. But not until we're absolutely certain we can prove every element of the case." "How long do you think you need?" I looked out Marcus's window at the courthouse across the street, its limestone facade solid and enduring. "Give me a week, maybe 2. I want to see how far they're willing to push this." After leaving Marcus's office, I drove to Home Depot and spent $300 on security equipment, cameras, motion sensors, smart door locks that could be controlled from my phone. The young man who helped me load everything into my truck looked skeptical. "This is a lot of gear for one house," he said. "You having trouble with break-ins?" "Something like that," I replied. Back home, I spent the afternoon installing the new system. The work felt good, precise, purposeful, familiar. I'd been doing this kind of installation for 40 years, though usually for other people's homes. There was something satisfying about applying those same skills to protect what was mine. The cameras went up first, positioned to monitor every approach to the house. The smart locks replaced the old hardware on both the front and back doors. The motion sensors covered the windows and the garage. When I finished, I had complete surveillance and control over who could enter my property. I tested the system from my phone, watching myself on the screen as I walked around the perimeter. The image quality was excellent. The motion detection sensitive but not oversensitive. If anyone tried to enter my house without permission, I'd know about it immediately. The sun was setting by the time I cleaned up my tools. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, reviewing the instruction manuals for the security system. Everything was working perfectly, integrated and automated like a modern fortress. At 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I checked the camera feed on my phone before answering. Madison stood on my porch, alone this time, holding what looked like a casserole dish. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "Richard, I brought you some dinner," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound caring and concerned. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I want to apologize. I think we got off on the wrong foot." "Did we?" She shifted the casserole dish to one arm and gestured with her free hand. "May I come in? I'd really like to talk." "We can talk here." Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Richard, I understand you're upset about the mortgage situation. Maybe Ethan didn't explain it clearly, but the truth is, he was trying to help you. Those medical bills after Caroline's illness, the maintenance costs on this big house. He was worried you were getting in over your head financially. It was smoothly delivered, practiced even. But I'd heard enough lies in my 72 years to recognize the cadence of deception. "Madison," I said quietly, "what medical bills?" "I'm sorry?" "You mentioned medical bills. Caroline's treatment was covered by insurance. Medicare, supplemental coverage, and a health savings account we'd been funding for 20 years. We paid every bill in full, on time. So, what medical bills are you talking about?" She blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting to be challenged on details. "Well, cancer treatment is so expensive." "You assumed wrong, just like you assumed I wouldn't check the signature on those loan documents." The mask slipped then, just for a moment. Her eyes hardened, her mouth tightened, and I saw the calculation behind the concern. Then she recovered, forcing the smile back into place. "Richard, I think you're confused. There's no shame in that. Grief affects everyone differently. But Ethan is just trying to make sure you were taken care of. By stealing my house? By helping you transition to a more manageable situation. Richard, be honest. When was the last time you used the guest bedrooms upstairs? Or the formal dining room? You're rattling around in all this space like a ghost." There was that word again. Ghost. As if my continued existence in my own home was somehow supernatural. Something to be exorcised. "Madison," I said, keeping my voice level, "I want you to listen carefully. This is my house. Caroline and I bought it, paid for it, and built our life in it. If you think you can take it from me through fraud and manipulation, you're about to learn how wrong you are." She took a step back, the casserole dish clutched against her chest like armor. "You're making a mistake, Richard. We're trying to help you, but we can't force you to accept help. If you want to be stubborn, if you want to make this difficult for everyone, that's your choice. But don't come crying to us when you can't handle things anymore." "I won't," I said, and closed the door. I watched through the camera as she stood on my porch for a long moment, her careful composure cracking. She said something to herself. I couldn't make out the words, but her expression was pure fury. Then she walked to her car and drove away, leaving the casserole dish on my doorstep like an abandoned peace offering. That night, I sat in Caroline's chair by the window, watching the security system's status lights blink quietly in the darkness. The house felt different now. Not just safer, but more mine. I'd reclaimed something that had been slowly slipping away without my noticing. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This doesn't have to be difficult. We can work something out." I deleted it without responding. 20 minutes later, another message. "You're being unreasonable. Think about what's best for everyone." Delete. Then, "Last chance to do this the easy way." I turned off the phone and set it aside. Threats were just words, and words couldn't hurt me anymore. I'd heard the worst words possible 3 years ago, when a doctor had told me there was nothing more they could do for Caroline. Everything after that was just noise. But as I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about strategy. They'd shown their hand now, revealed their tactics. Emotional manipulation, financial pressure, subtle threats about my competency. They were following a playbook, probably one they'd used before on other vulnerable targets. What they didn't understand was that I'd written a few playbooks of my own. 40 years in construction had taught me how to manage subcontractors, handle difficult clients, and outmaneuver competitors who thought they were smarter than the old man with calloused hands. They wanted a fight. They were about to get one, but it would be fought on my terms, using my rules, with weapons they never saw coming. I checked the security system one more time before turning off the lights. All green lights, all systems functioning perfectly. The house was locked down tight, monitored, and protected. Tomorrow, I would start phase 2 of my own plan. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was home. The call came at 7:30 in the morning, just as I was finishing my first cup of coffee. Unknown number, but I'd been expecting it. "Mr. Dalton, this is Dr. Sarah Whitman from Cedar Ridge Family Medicine. I understand there may be some concerns about your cognitive health and living situation." I set down my mug carefully, keeping my voice neutral. "Who told you that, doctor?" "Your son contacted our office yesterday. He's worried about you living alone in such a large house, mentioned some confusion about financial matters, possible signs of early dementia. He'd like us to conduct a wellness evaluation." The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't just trying to steal my house. They were trying to have me declared incompetent so I couldn't fight back. It was clever, I had to admit. If a doctor found me mentally unfit, they could have me placed in a care facility and manage my affairs however they saw fit. "Dr. Whitman," I said calmly, "I haven't been your patient in 15 years. Dr. Martinez has handled my primary care since Caroline died. If my son has concerns about my health, perhaps he should discuss them with my actual physician. Of course, I just wanted to reach out in case you needed support. I don't, but thank you for calling." I hung up and immediately dialed Dr. Martinez's office. As I expected, they'd received a similar call. Also as expected, Dr. Martinez had told them exactly what I would have. That patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing my health with anyone without written authorization. But the message was clear. They were escalating, moving from financial fraud to character assassination. The next step would probably be involving Adult Protective Services, claiming I was endangering myself through neglect or poor judgment. Time to accelerate my own timeline. I called Marcus first, then my bank, then my insurance agent. By 10 o'clock, I had appointments scheduled with all three. But first, I had a different kind of meeting to attend. The Cedar Ridge Community Center sat on the corner of Main and Elm, a brick building that had served as everything from a school to a voting station to a gathering place for grief counseling sessions. Today it was hosting the monthly meeting of the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post, and I had something to propose. I'd served 2 years in the Army back in the early 70s, mostly in Germany during the quiet years between conflicts. It wasn't the kind of service that earned medals or generated stories, but it had taught me about duty, honor, and the bonds that form between people who understand sacrifice. The meeting was winding down when I raised my hand. "Richard Dalton," announced the post commander, Walt Ferguson, a Vietnam veteran who had lost his left arm to shrapnel in 1969. "You've got something for us?" I stood, feeling the weight of 24 pairs of eyes. Most of these men were my age or older, gray-haired and worn by decades of civilian life, but their posture still carried echoes of military bearing. "I want to talk about legacy," I said, "about what we leave behind and who we leave it to." I told them about Caroline, about the house we'd built together, about the life we'd created in a place where love could put down roots and grow. I didn't mention the fraud or the family betrayal. That wasn't their burden to bear. Instead, I talked about stewardship, about the responsibility we had to ensure that good things endured. "I've been thinking about donating my lake house to the Post," I said finally, "converting it to a retreat center where veterans and their families could come for healing, for quiet, for the kind of peace that's hard to find in the regular world." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Walt cleared his throat. "That's generous, Richard. Damned generous. But are you sure? That property's got to be worth—" "I'm sure," I interrupted. "Caroline always said that home was meant to heal people. Maybe it's time it healed more than just us." The vote was unanimous. By noon, I had a letter of intent signed by the post commander outlining the proposed donation of my lake house property to the Veterans of Foreign Wars for use as a family retreat center. Marcus would handle the legal paperwork, but the intent was clear and documented. Phase 1 complete. At 2 o'clock, I was in my bank manager's office, explaining the situation to Janet Morrison, a woman I had known since she was a teller fresh out of college. She'd handled Caroline's funeral arrangements, had personally walked me through the process of removing her name from our accounts. She knew me well enough to recognize when I was serious. "Richard," she said after reviewing the Pinnacle mortgage documents, "this is clearly fraudulent. We need to freeze any accounts connected to this loan immediately. Can you do that?" I can put a hold on the funds, pending investigation. If they have already been moved to other banks, it gets more complicated, but we can start the process." She made several phone calls while I waited, her voice professional but firm as she spoke to colleagues at Pinnacle and other institutions. When she finished, she looked grim. "The money's been moved," she said. "Multiple transactions over the past 2 weeks, spread across different accounts at different banks. This wasn't amateur hour, Richard. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Can we trace where it went?" "With court orders, yes, but that'll take time. In the meantime, I've flagged your social security number for fraud alerts. Anyone trying to open new accounts or take out loans in your name will trigger immediate notification." "What about the house?" "That's trickier. The deed shows Ethan as co-owner, even though the filing dates are suspicious. We'll need to prove the ownership transfer was fraudulent before we can block any sale attempts." I thanked Janet and left the bank with mixed feelings. The immediate threat was contained, but the stolen money was already scattered to the wind. Recovering it would take months, maybe years, assuming we could recover it at all. But money wasn't really the point. The point was sending a message that I wasn't the helpless old man they thought I was. My phone rang as I was walking to my truck. Ethan's number. "Dad, what the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was tight with controlled anger, the tone he'd used as a teenager when he'd been caught breaking rules and was looking for someone else to blame. "I could ask you the same question," I replied calmly. "You called a doctor to report us? You told the bank we were stealing from you? Dad, you're losing it. You're paranoid and confused and what? Inconveniently resistant to being robbed? Nobody's robbing you. We're trying to help you." By forging my signature on loan documents? Silence. I could almost hear the wheels turning, the frantic calculation of how much I knew and how much I could prove. "Dad," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost pleading, "you don't understand the situation. The taxes on that house, the insurance, the maintenance, it's bleeding money. We were trying to create a financial cushion, something to help you manage the costs." It was smoothly delivered, almost believable. If I hadn't seen the bank records showing where the money had actually gone, I might have been tempted to give him the benefit of the doubt. "Ethan," I said quietly, "your mother raised you better than this. Don't," his voice hardened again, "don't you dare bring Mom into this. She would have wanted us to take care of each other. She would have wanted practical solutions to practical problems. Your mother would have wanted honesty. She would have wanted respect. She would have wanted her son to treat his father like family instead of like an obstacle to be removed." "Fine," he snapped. "You want to make this difficult? You want to paint us as the bad guys? Go ahead, but don't come crying to us when you can't handle things anymore. Don't call us when you fall down those stairs or forget to turn off the stove or wander into traffic because your mind isn't what it used to be." The threat was clear enough. If I didn't cooperate, they'd abandon me entirely, leave me to face whatever decline might come without family support or assistance. 3 years ago, that threat might have terrified me. The prospect of aging alone, of facing illness or injury without anyone who cared enough to help, would have been enough to make me consider any compromise. But I'd already lived through the worst thing that could happen to me. I'd watched Caroline die by inches, had held her hand as she slipped away into a darkness I couldn't follow. Everything after that was just details. "I won't be calling," I said, and hung up. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began making lists. On the left side, what they know. On the right side, what they don't know. What they knew was obvious enough. They knew about the bank's fraud investigation. They knew I'd refused to cooperate with their housing scheme. They knew I was no longer the passive, grieving widower they'd been counting on. What they didn't know was more interesting. They didn't know about the veteran's donation letter, which would make any attempt to claim ownership of the lake house significantly more complicated. They didn't know about the upgraded security system, which meant any attempt to enter my house would be recorded. They didn't know that Marcus had already prepared criminal fraud charges, waiting only for my authorization to file them. Most importantly, they didn't know that I was 3 steps ahead of them, planning moves they couldn't anticipate because they'd fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. At 9 o'clock, I called Marcus. "It's time," I said. "File the criminal complaints, all of them." "Richard, are you absolutely certain? Once we do this, they'll understand that actions have consequences, that you can't steal from people just because you think they're too old or too tired or too sad to fight back." "All right, I'll have the paperwork filed first thing tomorrow morning." After I hung up, I walked through the house one more time, checking the security system, ensuring all the locks were engaged. In the living room, I paused before Caroline's photograph, the one from our 25th anniversary trip to Maine. They underestimated us, I told her image. They thought grief made me weak. They thought being alone made me vulnerable. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, solid and enduring as the love that had built it. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across the walls before disappearing into the night. But they were wrong, I continued, about all of it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at intimidation and manipulation. They might try to have me committed. They might attempt to break into the house. They might escalate their threats or try to rally other family members to their cause. It didn't matter. I was ready for all of it. Because I wasn't just fighting for a house or a bank account or even my own dignity. I was fighting for the promise I'd made to Caroline in this very room, holding her hand as cancer stole her breath, that our love would endure, that what we'd built together would outlast both of us, that the life we'd created would mean something beyond the span of our individual years. They could forge my signature and steal my money. They could question my competence and threaten my independence. They could try every trick in the manipulator's playbook, but they couldn't touch what really mattered. They couldn't steal the memories embedded in these walls. They couldn't erase 32 years of marriage or diminish the love that had created this home. And they were about to learn that some foundations are too strong to be shaken, no matter how hard you try to undermine them. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking another day in what had become a war I hadn't wanted but was determined to win. Tomorrow, the counterattack would begin in earnest. Tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had built together, protected by walls that love had made unbreakable. They'd started this fight thinking they could overwhelm an old man's grief with their youth and energy and modern cynicism. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The morning brought autumn rain, the kind that strips leaves from trees and sends them skittering across pavement like scattered thoughts. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the drops streak down the glass, and felt the strange calm that comes before a storm breaks. Marcus had called at 7:30 to confirm that the criminal complaints had been filed. Fraud, forgery, theft by deception, conspiracy to commit theft. Enough charges to put all 4 of them away for a very long time if the evidence held up in court. The police would be serving warrants by the end of the week. But before that happened, I expected one final attempt at persuasion. They had realized soon enough that their careful plans were unraveling, and desperate people make predictable moves. They'd come here, probably all together, and try one last time to convince me that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. I was ready for them. The security system chimed at 11:15, motion detected in the driveway. I checked the camera feed on my phone and saw exactly what I'd expected. 2 cars, 5 people. Ethan and Madison in their SUV, followed by Gerald and Patricia Monroe in a silver sedan. The 5th person was a surprise, a woman in her 50s carrying a briefcase, her posture suggesting legal training. They'd brought their lawyer. I watched them cluster on my porch, the attorney speaking quietly to the group while they arranged themselves in formation. Gerald smoothed his tie, Patricia checked her reflection in the storm door glass. Madison adjusted her coat. Ethan stood slightly apart from the others, his jaw set with grim determination. When they knocked, 3 sharp raps, official and demanding, I took my time answering. Let them wait in the rain. Let them remember that this was my house, my threshold, my choice whether to let them cross it. "Richard," the attorney said when I opened the door, "I'm Catherine Walsh, legal counsel for the Monroe family. I believe we need to have a conversation." "Do we?" I didn't step aside, didn't invite them in. The rain was soaking their clothes, but I felt no obligation to shelter people who had come to steal my home. "This is ridiculous," Gerald muttered, water dripping from his hair. "Can we at least come inside and discuss this like civilized people?" I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd helped plan the theft of my house, who'd incorporated a shell company to hide stolen funds, who'd stood in my living room 3 days ago and lectured me about family obligations. "Civilized people don't forge signatures," I said quietly. "They don't steal from their in-laws. They don't threaten elderly widowers with commitment proceedings." Catherine Walsh stepped forward, her voice professionally neutral. "Mr. Dalton, I understand there's been some confusion about the mortgage arrangements. My clients are prepared to resolve this matter amicably, without involving the courts. The courts are already involved. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. I beg your pardon? Criminal complaints were filed this morning. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy. I expect the police will want to speak with all of you very soon. The group exchanged glances, their carefully rehearsed composure cracking. Patricia's hand flew to her throat. Gerald's face flushed red. Madison took a step backward, as if distance might provide protection. But Ethan moved forward, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "You bastard," he said, loud enough that neighbors might hear. "You senile old bastard. We were trying to help you, and this is how you repay us?" "Ethan," Walsh said sharply, "don't say another word." But my son was past listening to legal advice. 3 years of carefully managed resentment were boiling over, and the mask of filial concern was finally slipping away. "You want to know the truth?" he snarled, stepping closer to the door. "You want to know what we really think? You're pathetic. You've been pathetic since Mom died. Sitting in that house like a ghost, talking to her pictures, pretending she's still here. It's sick, Dad. It's mentally ill behavior, and everyone can see it except you." Each word was designed to wound, to find the soft places where grief had left me vulnerable. But I'd had 3 years to build scar tissue over those wounds, and his cruelty bounced off me like rain off slate. "Are you finished?" I asked calmly. "No, I'm not finished. You think you're protecting something, but you're not. This house, this whole shrine you've built to Mom, it's not real. She's dead, Dad, dead and gone, and no amount of pretending is going to bring her back. All you're doing is wasting space that living people could use." Patricia gasped at the brutality of it. Even Gerald looked uncomfortable, but Madison nodded slightly, as if Ethan was finally saying what she'd been thinking all along. I looked at my son, this stranger wearing a familiar face, and felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger. I'd moved past anger sometime during the night. This was something colder and more final, the sound of a door closing that would never open again. "Thank you," I said quietly. "What?" "I said thank you for making this easier." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded document, the letter of intent I'd signed with the Veterans Post yesterday. I handed it to Catherine Walsh, who scanned it quickly, her professional composure cracking slightly. "What is this?" she asked. "That's the deed transfer for my lake house property. I donated it to the Veterans of Foreign Wars yesterday. It's already been filed with the county clerk." The silence that followed was profound. Even the rain seemed to pause, waiting for the implications to sink in. "You can't do that," Madison said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I can. I did. The property you thought you were going to inherit? It belongs to veterans now. They're converting it to a retreat center, a place where people who actually served their country can find peace." Gerald's face had gone white. "That property is worth $500,000. Was worth $500,000. Now, it's worth whatever good it can do for people who deserve it." Catherine Walsh was flipping through the document, her expression growing more strained with each page. "This appears to be legally binding," she said reluctantly, "but surely you can't just give away property that your son has an expectation of inheriting." "My son has no legal claim to property I own outright, and after what he just said about his mother, he has no moral claim either." Ethan was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "You gave it away. You actually gave it away." "I did. Just like I'm going to give this house away if anyone tries to force me out of it." "You're bluffing." I pulled out my phone and showed him the contact information for the Cedar Ridge Housing Authority, the local Habitat for Humanity chapter, and 3 other charitable organizations. "Try me." The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through their expensive clothes, turning Patricia's carefully styled hair into wet strings. But none of them seemed to notice. They were too busy processing the collapse of their careful plans. "This is insane," Madison said, her voice shrill. "You're destroying your own family's future out of spite." "I'm protecting what my wife and I built from people who see it as nothing more than assets to be liquidated." Catherine Walsh closed her briefcase with a sharp snap. "My clients will be consulting with other legal counsel about their options. This conversation is over." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "But before you go, there's one more thing you should know." They were already turning away, but my words stopped them. "The mortgage money you stole, it's been frozen. Every account, every transaction, every penny you thought you were going to spend. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit will be tracing where it went And who authorized the transfers? Gerald actually stumbled, catching himself against the porch railing. You can't prove... I can prove everything. Bank records, forged signatures, shell companies, the whole conspiracy. You got greedy, and greed makes people sloppy. Ethan turned back toward me, his face twisted with something between rage and desperation. You're destroying our lives over a house. A house, Dad. Bricks and wood and memories that don't mean anything to anyone but you. I looked at him for what I knew would be the last time as his father. After today, we'd be strangers who happened to share DNA. Nothing more. You're wrong, I said quietly. This house means everything. It's proof that love can build something lasting. It's evidence that two people can create beauty together that outlasts their individual lives. It's a testament to your mother's strength and grace and the faith she had in the future we were building together. I stepped back, my hand on the door. But you never understood that, did you? You saw square footage and property values. You saw assets to be managed and problems to be solved. You never saw what Caroline saw. That home isn't a place, it's a promise. A promise to cherish what matters, to protect what's precious, to honor the love that makes it all worthwhile. The door closed between us with a soft click. I engaged the deadbolt and walked to the kitchen window, where I could watch them retreat to their cars. They stood in the rain for several minutes, arguing in voices too muffled to understand. Finally, they climbed into their vehicles and drove away, leaving my driveway empty, except for puddles that reflected the gray sky. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in Caroline's chair by the window. The house felt different now, not emptier, but somehow more itself, as if a weight I hadn't realized was there had been lifted from its rafters. The phone rang at 2 o'clock. Marcus. Richard, I just heard from the prosecutor's office. They want to meet with you tomorrow morning to go over your testimony. This case is going to move fast. How fast? Arraignments by the end of the week, trial within 6 months, assuming they don't plead out. And if they do plead out, prison time regardless. The evidence is too strong for anything else. After we hung up, I walked through the house one more time, seeing it with fresh eyes. Caroline's presence was stronger here now, as if my defense of our shared life had somehow deepened her connection to these rooms. In the bedroom, I picked up her photograph from the nightstand. Her smile was exactly as I remembered it, warm, patient, full of the quiet strength that had sustained our marriage through every challenge. It's over, I told her image. They can't hurt us anymore. Outside, the rain was tapering off, and patches of blue sky were beginning to show through the breaking clouds. By evening, the sun would be out, warming the earth, encouraging new growth. I thought about the veterans who would soon be using the lake house for their own healing. Broken soldiers finding peace beside the same water where Caroline and I had found so much happiness. It felt right, like the best possible use for a place that had been built on love. The doorbell rang at 4:30. I checked the security camera, expecting to see police officers, or perhaps reporters who'd gotten wind of the story. Instead, I saw a familiar figure, Walt Ferguson from the Veterans Post, holding an envelope. "Walt," I said, opening the door, "come in out of the weather." He stepped inside, shaking raindrops from his jacket. "Richard, I wanted to thank you personally for what you're doing. That lake house, it's going to mean everything to our boys who are struggling. Caroline always said it was a healing place. Well, it's going to heal a lot more people now." He handed me the envelope. "The paperwork's all done, legal transfer, tax exemptions, the works. You're officially no longer the owner of that property." I opened the envelope and scanned the documents. Everything was in order, stamped and notarized and filed with the appropriate authorities. The lake house that Ethan had counted as part of his inheritance was now beyond his reach forever. "One more thing," Walt said. "We voted to name it the Caroline Dalton Veterans Retreat. Seemed fitting, given what you told us about her." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The gesture was so unexpected, so perfect, that it took my breath away. "She would have loved that," I managed finally. After Walt left, I sat in the gathering dusk, thinking about legacy and sacrifice and the difference between taking and giving. Tomorrow would bring court dates and testimony and the formal process of justice. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Caroline's death. Peace. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, solid and enduring as the love that had built it. Somewhere out there, my son was probably meeting with lawyers, planning appeals, calculating his chances of salvaging something from the wreckage of his schemes. It didn't matter. He'd made his choice when he decided that love was less important than money, that family was less valuable than opportunity, that his father's grief was an inconvenience to be managed rather than honored. I'd made my choice too, to protect what mattered, to honor what was sacred, to ensure that Caroline's memory would live on in ways that had nothing to do with property deeds or inheritance laws. The grandfather clock chimed 6 times, marking the end of a day that had changed everything. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. I was home, truly home, for the first time since Caroline died. And nothing, not fraud, not family betrayal, not threats or manipulation or legal schemes, could take that away from me. The war was over, and love had won. Spring came early to Cedar Ridge that year, arriving with the kind of gentle warmth that makes you believe in second chances. I stood in Caroline's garden, watching the daffodils she'd planted 20 years ago push through the last patches of snow, their yellow faces turned toward a sun that finally carried the promise of renewal. 6 months had passed since the arraignments, 4 months since the plea bargains were finalized. Ethan had received 3 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. Madison got 18 months. Gerald and Patricia Monroe were sentenced to 2 years each, though Patricia's sentence was reduced to house arrest due to her age and health issues. The stolen money, what was left of it, had been recovered and returned, most of it anyway. Gerald's investment company had managed to lose nearly $50,000 in some cryptocurrency scheme before the FBI froze the accounts. I donated that recovered money to the Veterans Retreat as well, figuring it was better used healing wounded souls than sitting in my bank account as a reminder of betrayal. The house felt different now, not smaller exactly, but more purposeful. I'd converted Caroline's sewing room into a small library, lined the walls with the books we'd collected over 3 decades of marriage. The guest bedrooms had become spaces for the projects I'd never had time for when I was building other people's dreams. Woodworking, model airplanes, the kind of intricate handwork that required patience more than strength. I still talked to Caroline sometimes, usually in the evening when the light slanted golden across the living room, where we'd spent so many quiet hours together. Not the desperate conversations of early grief, but the comfortable exchanges of a long marriage that had learned to accommodate even death. "The roses are coming back strong this year," I told her photograph one April evening. "That David Austin variety you loved is budding early. You were right about the fertilizer." The mail had brought another letter from Ethan that morning, the 5th since his sentencing. I'd read it, as I'd read all the others, then filed it in the folder I kept in the desk drawer. He was getting counseling in prison, he wrote. Learning about addiction, not to drugs or alcohol, but to easy money, to shortcuts, to the kind of thinking that made other people's belongings look like opportunities. He was sorry, he claimed, not just for the theft, but for the way he had spoken about Caroline, about our marriage, about the life we'd built in this house. He understood now, he said, what he'd tried to destroy. I didn't reply to the letters. Some conversations required presence, required looking into someone's eyes to judge the sincerity of their words. Prison letters were just words on paper, and I'd heard too many of Ethan's words to trust them without proof. But I kept the letters anyway, filed next to the birthday cards he'd sent as a child, the college graduation photo where he'd looked so proud and hopeful, the wedding announcement that had arrived via text message, the complete record of a relationship that had started with such promise and ended with such disappointment. Madison had divorced him 3 months after the sentencing, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional distress. She'd moved back to her hometown, taken her maiden name, started working as a real estate agent. I'd heard through the local gossip network that she'd told people her marriage had been a mistake from the beginning, that she'd been manipulated by an older man with serious financial problems. History, rewritten by the victor. The Veterans Retreat had opened in March with a small ceremony attended by 20 families and a handful of local officials. I'd been invited to cut the ribbon, but I'd declined. Caroline would have preferred the attention go to the people the retreat was meant to serve. Instead, I'd visited quietly the following week, walking the grounds where Caroline and I had shared so many peaceful moments. The VFW had made thoughtful changes, wheelchair-accessible paths, a meditation garden where the old tool shed had been, a dock rebuilt to accommodate veterans with mobility challenges. But the essential character of the place remained unchanged. I'd sat on the new dock for an hour, watching the water and listening to the sound of laughter from the main house, where a group of Vietnam veterans were playing cards on the screened porch. It was exactly what Caroline would have wanted, a place where broken people could remember how to be whole. "Mr. Dalton," I turned to find a young woman approaching, maybe 30 years old, walking with the careful gait of someone whose injuries weren't immediately visible. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she said. "Army medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan. I wanted to thank you for what you did here. You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." She sat beside me on the dock, her eyes fixed on the water. "I've been struggling since I got back. PTSD, survivor guilt, the whole package. My therapist recommended this place, said it might help to be somewhere peaceful." She was quiet for a moment, then continued. "I've been here 3 days, and I slept through the night for the first time in 2 years. There's something about this place. It feels safe in a way I'd forgotten was possible. My wife always said it was a healing place. She was right, and I wanted you to know that what you gave up, it matters. It's going to matter to a lot of people like me who need to remember that the world still has good places in it." After she left, I sat on the dock until sunset, thinking about sacrifice and purpose, and the different ways love could manifest itself in the world. Caroline and I had built that lake house as a private refuge, a place where we could escape the demands of daily life and simply be together. Now it was healing people we'd never meet, creating peace for souls we'd never know. It felt like the best kind of multiplication. Love invested, love returned with interest to a world that needed more of it. The drive home took me past the courthouse where the sentencing had taken place, past the bank where Janet Morrison still handled my accounts with the protective care of someone who had witnessed betrayal and chosen loyalty instead. The town looked the same as it had for decades, but I saw it differently now, not as a backdrop for my solitary existence, but as a community of people who'd shown me kindness when I needed it most. Dr. Martinez, who had refused to discuss my medical information with strangers. Walt Ferguson and the Veterans Post, who had embraced my donation with gratitude instead of suspicion. Marcus Chen, who had fought for me with the dedication of a friend rather than just a lawyer. Even Tom Fletcher, my neighbor across the street, who'd started bringing his trash bins in on garbage day instead of leaving them on the curb until evening. A small gesture, but one that said he was paying attention, that someone cared about the appearance of our shared neighborhood. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the house Caroline and I had built together. It looked solid and welcoming in the evening light, its windows glowing warmly, its gardens showing the first green promise of spring. The security system I'd installed in my anger was still functional, still monitoring every approach to the property, but I'd stopped checking the camera feeds obsessively, stopped jumping at every unexpected sound. The threat had passed, and vigilance could give way to simple awareness. Inside, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table while reading a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright that Caroline had bought me for Christmas 3 years ago. I'd never gotten around to opening it during the dark months that followed her death, but now I found myself fascinated by the architect's philosophy of organic design, his belief that buildings should grow naturally from their environment. It made me think of our own house, how we'd adapted its structure to accommodate the slope of the land, how we'd oriented the windows to capture the morning light Caroline loved, how we'd built it to shelter not just our bodies but our dreams. The phone rang at 8 o'clock, Dr. Martinez's office, confirming my annual physical next week. Normal life proceeding normally. At 8:30, Marcus called with an update on the civil suit we'd filed to recover legal fees and damages. At 9, Walt Ferguson checked in about plans for the retreat center's summer programs. Ordinary conversations about ordinary concerns. The kind of routine interactions that had seemed impossible during the worst of my grief but now felt natural again. Evidence that healing could happen slowly, invisibly, until one day you realized you were no longer the person you'd been in your darkest hour. Before bed, I checked the locks out of habit rather than fear, then sat in Caroline's chair by the window. The street was quiet, lights glowing in neighboring houses where other lives were being lived with their own mixtures of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. I thought about Ethan, alone in his cell, perhaps writing another letter I might or might not answer. I felt pity for him, but not the crushing guilt I'd expected. You could love someone and still refuse to be destroyed by them. You could grieve for what they'd become without taking responsibility for their choices. Caroline's photograph smiled at me from the side table, her expression eternally patient, eternally understanding. In the lamplight, she looked exactly as she had on our wedding day, radiant with hope, certain that love was strong enough to build something lasting. She'd been right, as usual. Love was strong enough. Not the selfish love that demanded possession, but the generous love that created space for other people to flourish. Not the desperate love that clung to what was passing, but the confident love that invested in what endured. I'd learned to love the house not because it was mine, but because it had been ours. I'd learned to love my memories not because they were all I had left, but because they were gifts that no one could steal. I'd learned to love my solitude not because I preferred it to companionship, but because it had taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking another day in a life that had found its rhythm again. Tomorrow, I would work in Caroline's garden, tend the roses she'd planted, maybe start planning the addition I'd been considering, a small workshop where I could build furniture for the veterans' retreat. Tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the house that love had built, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and properly defended. The war was over, the peace was real, and somewhere in the darkness outside my windows, spring was gathering its strength for another season of renewal, another chance for broken things to grow whole again. I turned off the lamp and headed upstairs, my footsteps echoing softly in the hallway where Caroline had once walked beside me. At the top of the stairs, I paused to look back down at the living room, where we'd shared so many evenings, where we'd built our life one conversation at a time. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty house, to the memories that filled it, to the love that had made it all possible. Then I went to bed, in the room where Caroline had drawn her last breath, in the house she'd helped me design, in the life we'd created together and that I'd finally learned to live alone. Outside, the wind stirred through the maple tree we'd planted for our 30th anniversary, its new leaves rustling with the sound of promises being kept, of love outlasting even the people who'd created it. I closed my eyes and slept deeply, dreamlessly, completely at peace. For the first time in 3 years, I was home.